everybody. This is my lecture on Sidgwick's The Methods of Ethics. It's a topic that I want to cover, which I think is really basic and incredibly important, is just what is Sidgwick trying to accomplish in this very long book. So right away, he announces that one of the things he's trying to do is to set the boundaries of ethics as a science. So book 1, chapter 1, very first thing that he says: the boundaries of the study called ethics are variously and often vaguely conceived, but they will perhaps be sufficiently defined at the outset for the purposes of the present treatise if a method of ethics is explained to mean any rational procedure by which we determine what individual human beings ought, or what it is right for them to do or to seek to realize by voluntary action. So this is a kind of, well, at this point, very standard way of characterizing what the project is in normative theory. And I think it's pretty clear that Henry Sidgwick is in large part responsible for how contemporary normative ethical theorists understand what it is that they do for a living. And the emphasis on the word individual is very important for Sidgwick, because another thing that he wants to be clear about, and again, this gets to the heart of the project of defining boundaries, is that he's not doing politics. So that's the reason for the focus on individuals. He says that politics seeks to determine the proper constitution and the right public conduct of governed societies. Both ethics and politics are distinguished from positive sciences. How? By having as their special and primary object to determine what ought to be, and not to ascertain what merely is, has been, or will be. So here he's announcing that this is explicitly normative, right? It's not descriptive. He's not engaged in a descriptive enterprise. He's doing normative theory, what ought to be, or what ought to be realized by individuals through voluntary action. Another thing that I want to mention about what's going on in book 1, chapter 1, is the use of the term science or scientific. So what Sidgwick ends up saying is that he's undergoing a study or an investigation that he thinks is scientific, or that aspires to be scientific, and we'll talk about what exactly that means, but is not, strictly speaking, a science. So he thinks of a science as the positive sciences, and examples that he gives of positive sciences which must be held distinct from ethics are things like sociology, psychology. These are different from both ethics and politics insofar as psychology and sociology and related sciences don't ask questions about, they're not normative, right? They're not asking questions about what ought to be, but they're only concerned with an empirical investigation into what is actually the case. So the next thing that Sidgwick is sort of keen to establish is that everyone more or less agrees that when we think about the question, what ought I to do, we're thinking about what it means to act according to reason or reasonable principles that govern human action. And then he notices that, well, there's disagreement here, right, about what these principles are. He's also interested in the question, what are the different practical principles or rational ends which the common moral sense of mankind is prima facie prepared to accept as ultimate. And here he thinks there are basically only two candidates for ultimate ends or ultimate principles of practical reason. There's happiness, understood in the sense that he will lay out, and then there's moral perfection. So this is already a little bit confusing, since we just read Aristotle, where moral perfection and happiness are the same thing. So already we have to be aware that whatever Sidgwick means by happiness, it's definitely not what Aristotle meant by eudaimonia, but these are basically the two candidates that he thinks are on offer for ultimate principles, happiness and moral perfection. And then, the three methods of ethics that he identifies are egoism. This is like reasonable self-love or egoistic hedonism, something that he calls intuitionism, and of course, utilitarianism, which, spoiler alert, is going to be his preferred method. That's the one that he thinks is going to win out in the end. To be clear that I don't think Sidgwick's goal in the methods of ethics is to put forward an explicit defense of utilitarianism. I think that if that were his goal, then he clearly fails. To give an explicit, convincing defense of it. But it's pretty clear by his own lights that that's not what he's doing. So he's identified these three methods. He thinks that each of the three methods points to some true feature of morality, where by morality he means the common sense morality of mankind. And he thinks that these methods, these three methods that he's going to be discussing, when they're considered just on their own, like if you just think about that bit of truth that they reflect, then you're likely to assent to them. But the trouble is once you start to compare them, you realize well, they all can't be true. And once you start to compare them, it becomes difficult to know which one you're supposed to pick. Now, he says on page 14 what his actual goal is, and it's far more limited than an explicit philosophical defense of utilitarianism, although it is clear that utilitarianism is the method that he thinks is going to win out at the end of the day. So again, this is page 14. My object in the present work is to expound as clearly and as fully as my limits will allow the different methods of ethics that I find implicit in our common moral reasoning, to point out their mutual relations and where they seem to conflict, to define the issue as much as possible. So it's going to be part of the project of defining the issue as much as possible that utilitarianism is going to turn out to be the method that in some sense wins out, or the other two methods in some sense are going to point to it. But something that I really want you to think about as you are journaling about Sidgwick, reading Sidgwick, maybe if you're thinking about writing a paper on Sidgwick, something that I really strongly encourage you to think about is, where is he getting this conception of the common sense of mankind, and is it a legitimate concept? So if you think about the methods on its own, it seems like all of the examples of the common sense of mankind that he's referring to are mostly other philosophers, right? So he'll talk about the Stoics, he'll talk about Cicero, he'll talk about Plato and Aristotle, he'll talk about a ton of the British moralists. Occasionally he'll refer to religious people, but it's not really clear who he's talking about. It's not really clear that he's giving their point of view a fair shake. It's not really clear that he's accurately reflecting the common sense moral reasoning of all of mankind. And this is an important question for Sidgwick, because insofar as he aspires to something scientific, then his concepts better be properly scientific. And it's notable that this notion of common sense moral reasoning, or the common sense morality of mankind, he doesn't ever really seem to, he just sort of takes it for granted. And so it's an interesting project to sort of track what comes up under the heading of common sense morality of mankind, and whether or not we think it's a good a good enough standard against which to judge our moral intuitions. So, what is the distinction between the moral and the prudential? Well, it's a distinction that Sidgwick thinks that we find in our ordinary moral consciousness. And he says, in ordinary moral reasoning, we distinguish between judgments of duty from judgments, and these, he says, are judgments about what it is right or what ought to be done, from judgments about an agent's private interest or happiness. So there's this kind of dualism in practical reason that he wants to point out. On the one hand, you might be thinking about what's in your interest, and on the other hand, you might be thinking about your duty or what you ought to be doing. Well, the next thing that Sidgwick wants to do after he's drawn this distinction between moral judgments, properly so called, and merely prudential judgments, or moral judgments have to do with what you ought to do or what it is right to do. He wants to be really clear that his notion of right cannot be captured in terms of the fittingness of a means to an end. So it's not an instrumental conception of rightness, like it's right for me. I don't know, it's right for me to brush my teeth insofar as I want good dental hygiene. Um, that's a that's maybe a fine sense of right, but it's just not the moral sense of right that he is trying to elucidate in this chapter. Sense of rightness that he's after um, are things that are right unconditionally or without qualification or categorically. And specifically, he wants to say without regard to ulterior motives or results. So, regardless of the consequences, is another way of stating this. And he thinks that it might be the case that certain ends or goals are simply right to adopt in this unconditional categorical sense of right. Zwick denies that moral rightness can be cashed out in terms of the fittingness of some means to an end. He doesn't think that what is morally right in the common sense term that he's trying to articulate in this chapter um, can be understood as a means to an end, even of even, even of an ultimate end. So in the previous chapter, he was talking about two candidates for ultimate ends. One was happiness, and one was moral perfection. He doesn't think that this notion of moral right can be understood in terms of that which is fitting or conducive even to those ultimate ends. Sidgwick ends up arguing is that this concept of moral ought or moral rightness is fundamental and primitive, which just means that it can't be reduced to some other more basic concept. It is itself primitive. And another move that he makes in this chapter is to associate the assertion that something is right or that you morally ought to do it is associated with what he calls the moral sentiments, or these specifically moral feelings or emotions. So if you look on page 27, he writes the following. The peculiar emotion of moral approbation is, in my experience, inseparably bound up with the conviction, implicit or explicit, that the conduct approved is really right. In other words, that it cannot without error be disapproved by any other mind. If I give up this conviction because others do not share it, or for any other reason, I may no doubt still retain a sentiment prompting to the conduct in question, or what is perhaps more common, a sentiment of repugnance to the opposite conduct, but this sentiment will no longer have the special quality of moral sentiment, strictly so called. So there is a kind of universality that's baked into this idea of a specifically moral sentiment. So it's this conviction that you have when you make this kind of moral assertion of something's rightness or that somebody ought morally to do it, that the conduct approved is really right. Um, and so it cannot be disapproved of by any other mind. With Sarah on Blackboard was asking about these moral sentiments. Um, and it seems to me, at any rate, that the morality or the moral character of these sentiments is deeply connected to its universality. So there's some cognition or recognition that the same sentiment would be shared by any other person capable of making the same judgment of ought or rightness. There are two further features of moral oughtness that Sidgwick tries to define. The second is that um, if you morally ought to do something and you don't do it, then you are subject to some sort of penalty. He doesn't get too specific about what he thinks that penalty is, but he thinks it's kind of baked into the concept of moral ought, that there is some kind of sanction or penalty for failing to do what you morally ought to do. And then the third aspect of moral oughts are that they are action guiding. And that specifically means that they give an impulse or motive to action. So that these aren't theoretical judgments. These aren't just judgments about the world and the way things are. They're judgments about what someone ought to do or how they ought to be. And he thinks that they must therefore be action guiding, and the only way for them to be properly action guiding is for the making of the judgment to carry with it an impulse or a motive to action. I mean, he basically admits on page 35 that if upon reflection you don't find in your consciousness any such unconditional or categorical imperative that he's been trying to lay out, then like he doesn't really have an argument. Because again, he just thinks it's a fact of common moral reasoning. And he says, I do not know how to impart the notion of moral obligation to anyone who is entirely devoid of it. I think, however, that many of those who give this denial only mean to deny that they have any consciousness of moral obligation to actions without reference to their consequences, and would not really deny that they recognize some universal end or ends, whether it be the general happiness or well being otherwise understood, as that at which it is ultimately reasonable to aim, subordinating to its attainment the gratification of any personal desires that may conflict with the same. But in this view, as I have before said, the unconditional imperative plainly comes in as regards the end, which is explicitly or implicitly recognized as an end at which all men ought to aim. And it can hardly be denied that the recognition of an end as ultimately reasonable involves the recognition of an obligation to do such acts as most conduce to the end. I mean, that's sort of an interesting remark, and it's useful to contrast that notion of an end with how Aquinas conceives of the end of happiness in the Summa Theologiae, right? So for Aquinas, it's a natural end. It's a natural end that makes practical reasoning possible. And I think that way of framing is something that Sidgwick just simply is not considering. So that's Sidgwick on ethical judgments or moral oughts. Again, if you took my Anscombe seminar and you have carefully read and reflected upon her essay, Modern Moral Philosophy, chapter 3 is a fun read, and it might be really fun to write a paper giving a kind of Anscomian critique of Sidgwick's account of ethical judgment. But there are some other issues here worth thinking about, again, in your journaling, or if you're thinking about a paper topic. One of them is that Sidgwick seems very confident in this chapter that he can distinguish between morality and conventional opinion. Is he entitled to this confidence? Why or why not? Um, and are his arguments to the effect that ought and right are psychological primitives, that they're primitive concepts, concepts that we just have as part of our moral self-consciousness? Are those is that convincing? Um, and again, maybe this goes back to the first one. Are they convincing in light of certain Anscomian critiques?